Welcome to Robot Unicorn. We are so glad that you are here. As always, let's start the show with a question from Scott.
Well, this episode, maybe we should have planned this out a little better. Should have been launched the week of, well, this week, because this week is Valentine's Day. But we're talking about love this week, and it's going to launch like 3 or 4 weeks after Valentine's Day. But
Perfect.
That's okay.
You can remember to love each other after Valentine's Day. Love is not a trendy one day of the year thing.
It's not a consumer holiday. Is that what you're saying to me?
That's probably why we forgot, because neither of us actually celebrate Valentine's Day. So we probably just weren't thinking about it.
Okay, well, we've talked about this for a while. I feel like it's maybe going to be slightly controversial to some listeners. I don't know. We'll see. But also, over the past couple weeks, I've been going back to my dad's house and looking at photos of things from my childhood. And one thing I remember vividly is hearing about how important the 5 love languages are. And I used to always think, like, that doesn't make any sense to me, that every person just has 5 love languages and that's it. And I know it's very popular. And anyways, I wanted to get into asking you questions about the 5 love languages, because I will bet my assumption is that you also don't really agree with using them.
Can we just, I don't want to interrupt you.
Okay.
But to interrupt you, can you introduce what the 5 love languages are, or were you going to get there?
I was going to get there.
Oh, okay.
Do you not see all my notes for this
Too
one?
soon. That's not his love language, interrupting.
I have
Don't spoil it.
3 pages of notes on this one, which usually I have maybe 1 page, but I actually did a full lit review in order to prepare for this.
Well,
because
you might
I know,
have more than me to say today.
Well, because I know some people find this to be incredibly useful, important. I don't know. But the 5 love languages, I'll just give a brief history of what that is. For anyone that doesn't know, it was developed by Dr. Gary Chapman in 1992. It's a long time ago. He, I think, was a Baptist preacher. And it's just based on his anecdotal counseling experiences. He saw that, according to him, people had these 5 distinct love languages that they felt most loved through. And those 5 primary ways are words of affirmation, or like praising someone verbally, quality time, so focused attention on someone, spending time with them, receiving gifts, so like a symbolic token of your love, acts of service, so doing things that are helpful and like in service to someone else, and physical touch, which I think that's self-explanatory. And the whole point of, I guess, the book, it's a book, or is it more than just that?
It's a book. There's a children's book, same kind of thing, 5 love languages for kids.
I did not get into that in my review, so I don't know anything about that.
I mean, it's very similar, same thing, but for kids. Okay. And then I think there's workbooks and additional material type of stuff.
Yeah, so the emphasis is on finding and responding to, let's say for you, I need to find what your love language is, and then use that to show you that I love you.
Yes.
Which, on the surface, sounds like a good idea. And I would say that kind of makes sense. The only problem I have is that it basically, to me, it sounds like you're boxing people into, you're like, one of these is your love language that you desperately need to feel loved. And the reason why I was thinking about that, so going back to me looking at photos and things from when I was a kid, this was like, I don't know, the thing that we were supposed to do. We were supposed to find our partner's love language. And obviously my parents are no longer together, so, and it's not as though they didn't try doing these love languages or whatever. Maybe it was one-sided, but
I think the love language stuff, I think it's important to say it has deep roots in the church communities.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people, you probably have heard of this if you did grow up in like some type of faith-based community. If you're still in it, it's still very widely used in those communities. And again, it's not like, and we'll get into the reasons why this might not be the most effective. I mean, we're never going to say it's bad to, hey, spend the quality time with your partner, right? But I think one of the main issues is that it's very surface level.
Yeah.
And people like, let's say, your parents, or even maybe people trying to use this on their kids, they might box you in to say, okay, well, your love language is words of affirmation, right? Without going any deeper. So then if I'm saying to you all the time, Scott, my love language is words of affirmation, right? But in reality, maybe I'm a really anxious person who has deep social anxiety or deep anxiety, and now I'm asking you to give me words of affirmation. That's not,
Tell me I'm okay.
tell me I'm okay. Tell me I'm good. Tell me all these things. And I'm telling you that's my love language. But on the deeper level, there's so much more going on. And I think this book, and the reason why maybe we both feel passionate about this, is because it was kind of used in our lives as maybe like a gold standard of how to treat your partner. And I think even when we, like right before we got married, I think we had a bunch of people gift this book to us.
Yeah, didn't we have?
We definitely had copies.
Yeah, we probably got rid of them by this
They've
point now.
since been gotten rid of, but we had copies of it, and I think it's always well-meaning, right? Like, find your partner's love language, but what we see is if that's it, it's not going to necessarily save your marriage. So that's kind of where we're coming from, I think.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So do you see... Okay, I guess I want to back up. And the reason I'm skeptical of this is mostly because it's packaged like way too neatly. And maybe I just see that with what we do and like some of the people that we compete with. The more neatly you package something, neatly is maybe not the simply. I don't even know if that's the right term. It's almost like the easier you make it seem to reach this ideal, the more money you can make.
Yes.
Right? And that's why we try not to do that.
It's so much easier for me to say, if you find my one love language and you just start doing that thing, our marriage is no longer, or partnership is no longer going to be in struggle.
If you find your child's love language, then you're no longer going to have any behavior that you don't want to see, or because your child is going to feel so loved.
And I think the reason that you and I both have feelings towards this is we've both seen partnerships where they've had this book, and not to just only pick on this book, that's what this topic is, but like anything that's black and white, right? And it's like, okay, well, I've read the book and I've decided that my love language is gifts, for example. And now, because I've decided that that's my love language, that's how I feel the most seen in my partnership, I'm now expecting my partner to get me gifts. So now the partner's like, okay, I guess I got to get my partner flowers all the time, or chocolate, or little gifts. And so then they try doing that, and then the issue is still not being fixed. And it's like, well, I'm speaking your love language. I'm doing what you want me to do. And I think the majority of the time, our issues in relationships are so much more complex than just, you have to start getting me gifts so I feel seen.
Now, have you seen this play out in like therapy sessions before?
Yes. So prior to having kids, or maybe kind of at the start of having kids, I did a lot of work with different churches and people who were in the church or maybe coming out of the church. And I would say that this was brought up a lot, like this specific concept. And again, I'm not saying it's all bad, like quality time. Yeah, we all need to spend quality time with each other, right? Like nothing in there is bad. Acts of service, words of affirmation, like all of that makes sense and can be helpful maybe as a starting point. So I want to be careful to just, say everything is awful in there.
Right. So it's almost like a conversation starter rather than the ultimate end goal of relationship.
Mm-hmm. We're not looking... I think if you're looking at the book as like a conversation starter for, hey, how can I maybe show I care about this person? Maybe it's a nice starting point. But I think what would often happen is that people would have these deeper, complex struggles in their relationship, right? So I'll give an example of, like, let's say their sexual relationship wasn't working, right? But then the partner goes, well, my love language is physical touch. So, I need you to have sex with me more often because that's my love language. Well, now we have a partner who's having a very difficult time with their sexual relationship. And then the other partner saying, well, this is the only way I feel your love, which that's a whole maybe other separate issue, that the only way you feel the love is through sex. And now we have a partner being pressured to have sex.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that is one true example, but like many variations of that I would see. And then I think because as humans, we love rules and we love structure. And a lot of people were given this book to read, right? And as a way to resolve their marriage, then they get really stuck on it, right? Or the partner, let's say one person, I was talking about this words of affirmation. I saw this over and over. If I say my love language is words of affirmation, and maybe there's a point in our marriage where I would have even said that as an anxious person. I don't know, like maybe early on.
Yeah, maybe. I feel like you have used it more as a joke.
Yeah, I think early on I kind of saw through this, but I think when we first got the book, I was like, okay, I'll read it, I'll check it out. But again, the words of affirmation, like, do you need words of affirmation, or are you feeling not properly attached to your partner? And is there some anxious attachment going on here, right? Like, what's the deeper struggle? Because often it's not, we shouldn't need our partner to constantly say, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. You're the best partner in the world over and over again, right? That shows me that there's some anxious attachment. So again, it's not deep enough. And then we get stuck on trying to resolve deep marital issues on a surface level, and it doesn't work. And then they eventually, come see a therapist who wants to help them get to the deeper level or not.
Right. Why do you think we as a society, it seems in general, we want these neat little boxes for things to fit into? I feel like we've talked about this on other episodes too, but why is it even something like loving a spouse or your child? Why do we want it to fit into that box? Is it just because life is so chaotic and we're trying to find the easiest means to an end? I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like it involves maybe less thinking, and we have a lot often on our minds. And so things that are easier for us, I feel like even maybe evolutionary, like for our brains, it's just probably easier to latch on to something that's right there for you. Then you don't have to do the deeper thinking. I think another reason, especially stuff like this, and even when it comes to like tantrums, like, 4 scripts to save your child or whatever, a lot of us don't know how else to think about it, right? Like most of us
true.
aren't married to therapists that are like, hey, I'm reading this thing and it's feeling problematic for me based on the work that I'm doing every day with families or parents or couples. So let's talk about why I think this is problematic and why this probably won't work for our marriage. I mean, the majority of people, that's not their career. And
I mean, you've changed my mind on a lot of things.
Yeah.
That's just because you have that educational, like you have the understanding of it. You spent your life trying to understand it.
Yeah. So if that wasn't my life's work, I probably would read something like that and be like, oh yeah, that makes sense enough. And I think the other thing is, I mean, with everything, this is even with, conspiracy theories and stuff, if there's enough truth to something, it just seems like it makes sense.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about, like, are there any parallels between something that's overly simplistic, like the 5 love languages, and actual research that's been done on relationships?
I mean, I would say yes. It's not like I have all the research out in front of me right now. I think you did some research, so you might have some that you can reference. But I think about, let's say, the quality time that we spend together, right? So one thing that we know for sure that makes sense is that we need to spend quality time in relationship in order to have a thriving relationship. That's logical. You don't spend any time with someone, then you're not going to have a deepened relationship. But simply saying I need quality time with you and deeply evaluating what it means to have quality time together are two very separate things. Mm-hmm. I also think that there's a piece of, I think often we don't know ourselves as well as we think we do. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like someone might read that and be like, oh, for sure my love language is gifts because I love to receive gifts, which might be true on the surface, but that maybe isn't like a deep knowing of yourself. And
Yeah, why is it that you love receiving gifts so much?
Yeah, exactly.
Is it because you're receiving that attention when you're receiving the gifts? Yeah, I understand.
Yeah. So I think on the surface, some of the things make sense. Like but it's just so much deeper than that. You know what I mean? Like, let's say for a gift, for example, if I just give you a random gift, like I'm at the store and I see flowers and I bring it home and I'm like, oh, I should get Scott some flowers today. That would mean nothing to you, right? You'd be like, oh, okay, cool. Maybe Jess thought about me today.
You say that, but not necessarily. Because if it's the spring and you know that I'm about to start gardening and you bought me flowers.
Exactly. That's where I was going to go. I was going to say, but for Scott, so something that I know makes you feel seen. And I think at the root of all of these things, the words of affirmation, quality time, gifts, acts of service, and physical touch is, as always, what we talk about here, this deep need to be known and to be seen for who we truly are, right? And we could do that through any of those things.
Yeah.
And so, for example, for a gift for you, it's not just about a gift, like bringing you something random. If I want to truly know you and see you, I'm going to drive to your favorite roti shop. I'm going to get your favorite.
You know what's funny is you say that and immediately you say drive and I know that you're going to say roti.
And I do that for Scott. I know exactly where he likes to get his roti from. I know that he wants like the extra spicy shrimp roti.
Yep, curry shrimp.
With gravy on the side. Oh. Because I know you deeply. And I know that no matter what gift I get you, usually it's food, you are going to feel seen.
Yeah, why is food not on this list?
Right, exactly. Like there's so many ways we show love. And like, again, this is a neat box, but I truly don't believe that any one of us who are truly self-reflective fit only in one of those categories.
Well, doesn't the book not necessarily, like they say you have one main love language, but it's not necessarily that's your only love language.
Right. But still even one main love language. I would say our main love language is to feel deeply seen and understood. And then the way that we do that, maybe it's one of those 5, maybe it's totally different. Maybe it's through food, like you said. You know, like there's so many ways that we can show our love to each other. And if I were to read that and say, okay, Scott, well, my quality or my love language is acts of service, and that's my number one thing. And so then you go ahead and you do a whole bunch of stuff around the house for me, but I actually don't care about any of those things. And I would have rather you did the dishes.
Is that what you felt this weekend? That you didn't care about the things that I did around the house?
No, actually, you know what? I was going to bring up that something you did this weekend stood out to me as a way that you cared for me. And it wasn't act of service technically, but you know that I get very overstimulated by the lights in our house. I feel like this is something that's been going on for me for a long time, especially the older I get, the more at like 8:00 p.m. I cannot handle certain lights. Like I got to turn them all off. And what you've been doing around the house is not only setting up smart lights so I can kind of change the brightness as the day goes on, but you knew that there was these certain lights in our kitchen that were just like hurting my eyes.
Yep.
And without me even asking, you went and just changed all the bulbs to a warmer light.
Yeah, a warmer, slightly dimmer light.
Mm-hmm. And like that's an act of service that only someone who truly knows me to my core would know that those lights would bother me without me having to say.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could do 100 acts of service for me that don't show me that you deeply know me, but changing the lights to a warmer color, that shows me that you deeply know me, right? And that's the deeper stuff that we're talking about.
So me taking apart the engine of our snowblower and fixing that did not feel like an act of service to you?
I mean, I feel like that was more of an act of service to yourself.
Yeah, honestly, kind of was.
That is more like, okay, but let's talk about that. I think the other piece that maybe this book misses is that in order to know how you need to be loved, you need to deeply know yourself. And I think a lot of people going into marriage, or I mean, we're saying marriage, but really we mean any like long-term
any relationship,
committed relationship, or any relation, even friendship this applies to. The book just talks a lot about marriage, but like we're just talking about any relationship. To know how you want to be loved is to also to know yourself. And I think, like you said, like why can't people, they just kind of understand this or do this on their own? I think the majority of people out there don't deeply know themselves super well, right? And they might say, oh, I love gifts. But not necessarily have the ability to do the deeper reflection as to why gifts matter to them,
Right.
you know, or I love acts of service, but why, you know? So I don't know. I think there's just so much deeper that we can go on this topic.
Well, that is in engineering. Like I've used that in a lot of circumstances. The 5 whys, or like the root cause analysis. So you try and understand the root cause of an issue that you're facing, and you ask why 5 times, and that 5 times often, not always, but often will bring you to the underlying root cause of an issue that's happening.
Can we do that for one of the ways that we feel loved?
So why did you feel like me changing the light bulbs to warmer light was me loving you?
I've expressed so many times how overstimulated I get by the lights and how it just bothers me. And so you thinking about it before me having to ask you to do it felt really meaningful.
Why?
Because it just took less work for me. So I didn't have to say, Scott, can you change those light bulbs? And feel like I was putting that pressure on you. So I felt taken care of.
And why is that important to you?
I feel like it's not as common these days because I'm a mother and I run a business and all these things. It's not as common for me to feel taken care of. Usually I'm taking care of others.
And why do you think it's important for you to feel taken care of?
I think especially this weekend, our kids were a lot, especially our youngest. She was like on me and I just feel like I was taking care of her the whole weekend, and I kind of felt like I was a bit at a breaking point. Like I was sleeping in her bed and I was with her all day, and I just felt like I hadn't really had any time to take care of myself, and then that makes it really hard to take care of the kids.
Yeah. I mean, I can ask the 5th why, but I feel like we get the point of what this is doing.
Mm-hmm. So
I feel like a therapist there. Oh my goodness.
Essentially, that's what therapists do. My therapist, who I love, barely says anything to me. She just asks me pretty much that. Her thing is always, and what was the hardest part of that? And then I tell her the hardest part of that. Oh, and what was the hardest part of that? And then we get to the root. It's basically the same thing.
Yeah. Root cause analysis.
So now I'm going to write a book. It's called The 5 Whys.
That probably already exists.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm just kidding. That's not what
You don't
my
want to write
book's
a book
about.
called Root Cause Analysis?
Yeah, or that. That probably exists too.
Yeah, it definitely does.
Anyway, but that might be an interesting exercise. So if you've done the 5 love languages and you're feeling like, okay, we're still a little stuck. Like I feel like we're not actually resolving our marital issues or our relationship issues with this. Maybe try and ask why. Like, why do you think gifts are so important to you? Why do you feel like you need to have that? You know, try and get deeper, because that might help you move towards something that might actually help you in a different way.
Yeah. Okay, so in my review of all of the studies and articles and different things that have been done, I found that there is very little empirical support for the 5 love languages. Mm-hmm. So it kind of follows what you're saying. There's essentially nothing that really exists that says this is legitimate. And any studies that have done almost kind of refute what the 5 love languages talks about.
I think the important thing to note is that the book was based on someone's experience anecdotally.
Which is not a problem in itself. It's just, it has caused, I don't know, a lot of people to say this is the way to do it. Mm-hmm. And this is the only way you can do it. Can you remind me, have you been receiving a whole bunch of messages or something about this topic?
Well, I've received some messages about it. Specifically about, let's say, the kids angle.
Yep.
Because I think his framework is essentially that this should apply to, you know, friendships, kids.
Yeah, any work relationships.
Right. And so some people are trying to apply the love languages to their children, right? Like, okay, my kids really benefits from words of affirmation, so I'm just going to give them words of affirmation, but it's not necessarily working. They're not seeing the behavior change that they want to see, and they're not feeling connected with their kids. So they're like, hey, is this actually like real, the 5 love languages, or, you know, what's your thoughts? So that's the kind of thing. And then I'm not a couples therapist. I think I know enough about attachment to understand the relationships, but that's not the clientele that I work with. But I also get a lot of messages from parents who are trying to apply this with each other, especially in the chaos of parenting, which is already hard. And they are feeling disconnected from their partners and wondering why. You know, I'm doing the love language thing and I'm still feeling disconnected. So that's kind of where this stemmed from. Also, I just personally was interested in this topic and wanted to talk about it with you.
Well, and I'm sure that's because you know how I don't believe in it. But that's not necessarily that I don't believe in it, but I just think it's way too simplistic.
I think you and I have both seen this specific topic be hurtful to people in our lives.
Yep.
And that also makes us passionate to talk about it.
This is going to fix things for you. It's going to fix everything.
Yeah.
Just read this book and then it'll all be better, or go through this workbook.
Yeah.
But I do think like this in conjunction with more evidence-based relationship practices is probably not a bad thing.
I've seen, again, like when I was talking about the sexual stuff, I feel like there's a way that I've seen it being used in a way that's makes someone feel unsafe in relationship.
Yep, I can see that.
Especially when it comes to the physical touch category, and especially when it comes in the context of, let's say, a marriage where you maybe feel like, okay, now I have to do this in order to keep my partner happy and to make them feel loved. But there's reasons why the sexual pieces aren't working for you. And simply just getting over that and pushing yourself to be more physical with your partner doesn't fix your greater issue, and it can actually lead to a lot more separation.
You've answered a lot of my questions, so now I'm struggling to figure out where to go from here.
Can I ask you a question?
Yep.
So you've talked a little bit about how you've seen the love languages not necessarily work out and how you have feelings towards
Not necessarily work out, but just not work
definitely
out.
not work out.
Yep.
And you have a lot of feelings personally towards the love languages. I know, I mean, I talked about how we got the book and
okay.
and we've talked about it, right? So where do you think your skepticisms, or the reasons why you say the relationships that you've seen who've tried this have not worked out, what went through your mind when I said I want to talk about this today?
What went through my mind? Didn't I originally say I'm going to get us canceled? Because I feel so strongly about...
Yeah, but I want to hear your strong opinions. I feel like you've just been asking me. I think people want to hear from you too.
I will word this carefully. I think people have tried to fix relationships, like of, let's say, my parents. And maybe they were very well-meaning, but it has almost always come from a place of judgment and unhelpfulness. And I don't know. I've found that most of the time, rather than the person who's trying to help try and build a relationship and like try and help guide someone, like, hey, maybe see like a therapist and talk about these things rather than do the 5 love. I feel like it's easy to just buy a book. Here, this will fix it for you. Now I've helped.
Right.
Like in a lot of situations, me growing up, I feel like that was always the case. Here's something that you can read, do for yourself. Here's a little bit more work. We know you're struggling. This is going to fix it for you. And then they feel better about themselves for having helped. Meanwhile, what they're providing you is clearly a bunch of bullshit that's made in order for this person to make a boatload of money. And there's no, well, that's exactly what it is. It's people like the person who created it. Maybe they're great intentions at the beginning, but it clearly became a money, like their sole focus was just to make as much money as possible.
And in the process, hurting a lot of families.
Yeah.
Who think now, well, this is, especially I think in the Christian community where this is rooted in, if you have a Christian author who's writing this, who says they're a pastor,
you immediately
you trust it.
Yeah, they just trust that this person has the best intentions. There's too many. I don't even know if I want to name drop the other person that everyone loves that I also think does the exact same thing.
Save that for another podcast. We can do another one.
But there's
on that.
another big person that I know, a lot of family members and people that we know, love. And I think his only goal in life is to make as many millions of dollars as he possibly can off of people's trust of him. Yeah. So it's another person that, yeah.
You can guess who it is. You can let us know.
I'm sure people know who I'm talking about, but
here's the thing, and I think this is why we feel so passionate and we want to bring to light people who are, or books, or when we talk about, like 4 scripts to fit all for toddler tantrums, like I feel like you and I bring these topics up a lot because we're also in the business of sharing information and tools and stuff like that, right? And I think we always have this ethical desire in the back of our heads of, it would be so easy to say, here's 5 ways to solve your problem, and that's all you need. And if you just do these 5 things, everything will be better for you. And we can see that you can make a lot of money doing that, right? And I think anyone who comes out confidently and just says, hey, look, I've worked with lots of couples, even though I don't think he had training as a couples therapist, as far as everything I've read.
I don't know.
Might have to fact check me on that, but I was doing some reading as well, and that's what I was reading. So here's my work as a pastor with couples, and here's 5 things, and now if you go and do those things, your relationship will be fixed. I mean, everybody's going to want to buy that because everyone wants their relationship to be fixed. And then when it doesn't work, you think, I guess my relationship's not fixable. Well, relationships, whether it's with your partner or your child, are so much more complex than 5 things. And I think that's the point I really wanted to bring across and to give people hope, right? Like if you have done this book or anything that's just like so simple and you think that this will fix my marriage, in a relationship, you have 2 people with complex history, life experiences, attachment with their own parents, all of these things that bring you up to the point where now you're in a relationship with someone. And your old wounds will likely come back out, and they won't be resolved by having more physical touch or changing the light bulbs, right? Like these deeper wounds that we have in relationships need a lot more work and tending to, and it's hard and messy sometimes, but that's how you actually strengthen your relationship and come out of it on the other side.
You said before that people want to feel seen. They want to be deeply known by others, and that's how they feel that love from each other. And I think it's fair to say the same for kids. That's what they are looking for too. And that is not necessarily going to stop a tantrum from happening, but it's going to lead to that very close relationship that will hopefully make them healthier in terms of their relationships with others in the future, and your relationship with your child in the future as you get older and they move out. They're going to want to come see you still and want to talk to you and want to share about their whole life with you after this moment right now when they're little.
Yeah, exactly. So if we only focus on, for our kids, well, here's the 5 things to say or something during a tantrum, but we're not focusing on the deeper issue, which is developing a relationship where you're able to make your kid feel so deeply seen and known by you that they want to keep coming back to you, not only when they have tantrums, they're melting down, but when they're tweens and they're having a hard time, teens all the way into adulthood, because they know their parent is going to deeply see them and they can have this authentic relationship, right? Like that's the deeper work that we want to do, and that Scott and I are trying to talk about throughout this podcast. And I think it's the same thing in relationships, right? Like you could tell me, Jess, my love language is gifts and physical touch. And I could give you all the gifts and physical touch that you wanted to. But if you, well, I could, but I'm not going to. But if you, Scott, never did the deeper work to reflect on, why do you have trust issues? Why do you, like this is some of the stuff that you had to do, right? So that we could have a deep and meaningful relationship, right? It's like, why do you struggle with trust sometimes? Why do certain things trigger you? I don't even know. I'm trying to think of the deeper work that you've done. Who do you want to be as a partner in comparison to what you grew up with? What do you really value in a relationship? Like what matters to you? How do you actually build trust when you grew up and you couldn't trust your parents? How do you learn how to do that for the first time?
Mm-hmm.
And only after you are able to do some of those really hard and messy things could we have like a deep connected relationship, right? Where let's say you never did that work. You never did the work to be like, obviously I'm going to struggle with trust because I couldn't trust the person who I was supposed to trust growing up. And other people that I tried to trust growing up had terrible things happen to them, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So if you never did that work to be like, why is it sometimes hard to trust Jess? Like when we started our relationship, when we were dating. And will I ever be able to actually trust someone? And slowly letting your defenses down to let me in so that we could have an authentic relationship and talk about these things. And realizing that I'm human and I can make mistakes. And that doesn't mean that you can't trust me. It's just that sometimes I'm human and I make mistakes, but our foundation is solid and it's there. If you never did that work, we never had those deeper conversations, you could have said, our marriage could have been falling apart and you could have been like, well, my love language is gifts. It would have done nothing. It doesn't matter. We didn't have a foundation. We didn't deeply know each other and trust each other.
Yeah.
And I feel like the same for myself, right? Like if there's certain things I had to think about or reflect on, who do I want to be in a relationship? Who do I want to be married to? How do I feel deeply seen and appreciated? And how can I communicate that to my partner in a way that makes you able to care for me in the ways I need to be cared about? I could have told you, and maybe I would have at some point in our relationship, that I need words of affirmation, right? Because I was deeply anxious and I struggled with a lot of things. Right. But you could have given me words of affirmation all day long, and that wouldn't have fixed the deeper anxieties that I had. And so actually I had to do work to understand my own anxiety and my own issues and do my own deeper work and not be codependent on you in order to fix that, right? So I feel like sometimes even the love languages can lead to a codependence, right? Like if I'm relying on my partner to give me words of affirmation so that I can make it through the day, that's not really fair expectation for you.
Right. And can you explain why you don't necessarily want to be codependent on your significant other or someone else? Because in itself, codependence doesn't sound like a terrible thing, but
what I love is, I think this is Dr. Tracy, who we should definitely have on to talk about this. She's a couples therapist and a friend of mine, and she talks about interdependence. So it's not that we shouldn't be dependent on each other in marriage, of course. Like, of course I should be dependent on you and you should be dependent on me. But I think the difference between interdependence and codependence is like codependence is I can't function without you telling me that I'm okay and that you love me. And that if you don't tell me that you love me 5 times a day and text me that you love me, you know, on my lunch break, then I'm going to immediately assume you don't love me and I'm going to spiral out of control, right? Or I can't cope with any of my anxieties on my own. And the only way I'm able to get through the day is if Scott, you know, applies pressure on my back. And this is something that I used to need a lot of when I was super anxious, and tells me that, you know, a bear's not attacking me. You know, there's a time and place, of course, to be more dependent on the other person in marriage, depending on what you're going through. But codependence is when it's too enmeshed.
Yeah,
we don't have
it's taken to an unhealthy level.
Yeah, it's taken to an unhealthy level, and we don't have security in ourselves. Like, we're both our own people, and of course we need to be interdependent on each other, but I shouldn't need you to validate my feelings all day long in order for me to make it through the day.
Yeah.
That shows me that there's maybe an anxious attachment there, or there's not security in the foundation of our relationship.
Interesting. What would you say to maybe the person on YouTube watching, because we seem to get a certain type of comment from YouTube. What would you say to the skeptic on YouTube who, after listening to this whole episode, says, Jess and Scott, you're overcomplicating things now. So you're saying that the 5 love languages is oversimplifying, and now you're overcomplicating, because not everything has to be that deep. Sometimes it can just be as simple as giving your spouse a gift.
Right, sure. Give your spouse a gift. That's a great idea. I still buy you rotis. right? Because I know that that makes you feel.
Technically, roti is also plural.
Oh, sorry, roti. Because that makes you feel deeply seen and known. I think the foundation is the same, right? We need to feel deeply seen and known, and like we can trust our partner. That's the foundation. And I think trust in this case is actually more important than love. And I know that might be controversial, and that's coming from me. But you can have all the love in the world, but if you're not able to trust each other,
What's the difference?
right. Well, it maybe depends how you define love,
Yeah.
right? Like, I feel like people will say, I love you, and then they'll do things that are not trustworthy, right?
Right.
Like in relationships, especially ones that are really struggling, right? So you might say, I love you so much. Like, you mean the world to me. You're the most beautiful person in the whole wide world. Like, I would do anything for you. And then meanwhile, you're DMing random people online, right? That's not love. And you don't have trust. So I think in order to build like a really secure, solid foundation in your relationship, you actually have to have trust. And trust comes with repeated exposures to that person showing you that they're worthy of trust, right? So it's repeated times where you show up for me and help me with the thing I need help with, or you comfort me, or you make the decision that's in the best interest of our relationship versus in your own personal best interest, right? Trust comes in those moments when I say, hey, Scott, I want to have coffee together. And you say, okay, let's go do it. And we sit together and have a chat. So it comes in accepting what Gottman, who has great research, like Dr. John Gottman, called bids for attention, right? So am I skipping ahead again?
No.
Okay. So a bid for attention is anything that
It's for connection.
Oh, connection, sorry. I was just writing something about attention. A bid for connection comes from any time when I try and connect with you, right? And there's many different ways that you can try and connect, and you accept that bid and you come into relationship with me, right? And repeated times of me trying to bid for your connection and you accepting that bid and coming back teaches me that I can trust you. And it's the same with friends, right? And anything can be a bid for connection. There's like direct and indirect bids for connection. So direct would be like, hey, Scott, I want to have a coffee with you. Let's sit down and have a coffee together. Indirect might be like, I'm going to go have coffee in the living room in the hopes that you're going to come and take that bid and come have coffee with me. But that's how relationships are formed, and trust ends up being formed. And I think through trust, you can continue to develop your love.
Yeah.
But if all you have is love, and the love is without trust, we can't develop strong relationships.
This might be the first time that I've sat there and tried to figure out what the definition or differences are between trust and love. Because to me, I feel like they are the same thing, but...
Because for you and the defensiveness that you have, I think, inside because of your experiences in life, I don't think you can love someone unless you trust them first.
Yeah, right.
I think that's how you operate, right? Someone for you, because you have high defenses in terms of love, because of the hurt that you faced at a young age, I don't think that you can open yourself up to such a vulnerable emotion as love until you've already built trust. So I think, let's say, like with friends, like you've built friendships over time, right? And you're not necessarily opening up and bearing your heart and soul to your friends until you've developed that trust.
Yeah.
And the trust is developed by bids for connection with your friends, right? Like, hey, I'm going to go out for a beer here. You want to come? And then they come, and then, or maybe you text them about something 3D printed related, and then, hey, they actually responded. And now you're in a conversation. And over time, with all these bids being met, you've developed trusting relationships with your friend. And then through that trust, you're able to kind of develop these feelings of love and care. But I think for you, that comes next. But that's not the case for everybody. I think some people lead with love, and this might be more me. They lead with love and caring and empathy for another person, but the trust isn't necessarily there. And that's how you're hurt. I think that's happened to me lots of times in my life. So we just have different styles, different ways to go about it. But what I'm learning is you've got to have the trust there first in order to have that solid relationship.
So are you saying you've learned that from watching me? That I have a healthy...
Would I say that you have a healthy way? You've developed a healthier way to deal with it.
Yeah,
I
feel like.
And
It's
again,
better than it used to be, because the way
Yeah.
you're describing codependence, I was thinking while you were saying that, that was definitely me at the beginning of our relationship.
you were totally codependent. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And that's why I speak about this, but also from a place of empathy, because I feel like if you look at our relationship when we started out, it was definitely unhealthy.
Yeah.
Like there was codependence. There was a lot of jealousy from you to me. There was a lot of lack of trust in our relationship, which led to the jealousy and led to the codependence. And there was also like this interregulation where you had to try and regulate me so I wouldn't be anxious, and I had to try and regulate you so that you could learn how to trust me. Like I would not say we were the pinnacle of healthy
us.
relationship when we started.
Look at us growing.
Yeah. And that's why I'm trying to say, if we never did that growing, we just read a book that said give each other gifts and have quality time together, but we never understood how that made us feel deeply connected and known and seen, and figured out our own attachment issues, then what? I don't think we'd be in this place today.
If you could give parents or couples that are gravitating towards something like the 5 love languages, what would that one piece of advice be?
I have a hard time always narrowing it down to one piece of advice, It's kind of what we talk about.
I know. We're saying nothing's black and white. It can't be simplified, but if you could give just one piece.
I think about my colleague and friend and Dr. Deborah McNamara, and a piece of advice that she gave to me one time. And I'm going to butcher how she said it, so she'll say it way better than me. We'll ask her if she comes on the podcast. But she said something once about a relationship is there still love there on both sides? Right? And this wasn't necessarily like a marital relationship. And the person's like, yeah, there's still love there. There's still love to give. And the trust was broken. And this was in the relationship between a parent and child, like an adult child and a parent. And this adult child wanted to rebuild this relationship with their parent. And I think the parent wanted to rebuild the relationship with the adult child. And there was still love there on both ends. And the rupture wasn't so big that the love was gone, but the trust was gone. And so she said, okay, so then we have to figure out how to rebuild the trust. And rebuilding the trust has to come, like true trust comes from being authentic and being yourself. And that is so hard often in relationships, is to both have our guards down so far that we can be the most authentic version of ourselves. But I do think that's where true trust and relationship building actually happens. And I'm not saying you just let your guard down and let your partner into all your inner world if that's not safe for you. But I think that the answer to a lot of our marital struggles is seeing how we can rebuild that trust with each other and rebuild that safe foundation. And I'm trying to think of how we can start that. Like therapy is a great way. I wasn't joking about that. Sometimes you have to go to therapy in order to learn why the trust issues are there and how they were formed. One thing you can do, and this is based on the research of Dr. John Gottman, is if there is a bid for connection from your partner, maybe see how you can respond to that bid for connection, right? So if your partner is asking you to have coffee with them, like maybe you can sit and have coffee. And maybe in return, you can have a bid for connection back to them. And start to slowly have those bids, and whether that's in a friendship or a parent-child relationship or a relationship between partners, maybe you could start to have that kind of give and take of bids back and forth, and even having that conversation of being like, hey, we want to rebuild the trust, and how does that start? And doing so in an authentic way. And maybe the bid for connection, sorry, no, I'm really rambling here. The bid for connection comes from the place that you feel deeply seen and known. And so maybe you have to teach that to someone.
Yep.
Right? So if you feel, we'll go back to your roti scenario, before I knew that that would be a way that you felt loved by me, is if I went out of my way, let's say on a Saturday, I go out of my way to pick up this roti from the special shop that's 30 minutes from our house, and I know you love it, and I bring it home. But before I knew that about you, maybe you would have just said, hey, Jess, you want to go on a drive? I love this place for roti. I think you did.
Yep.
And eventually over time, I learned that that's a way I can love you. And then I do that on my own without you asking, and you feel deeply seen and known. So if you want to invite someone to deeply see you and know you, maybe you have to start to have your own bids for connection and take them along. Like help them see the truest, most authentic side of you.
Right.
And from there, you can build that trust.
I feel like that's a good place to end this episode too, because that answers my final question about what are some practical ways we can...
I think we should both share 2 or 3 ways that we feel deeply seen and known before we end. Just to, as we've both given one example, the roti and the lights, but maybe we have a couple, just so people can have a few more examples of how to go off of.
The biggest one, it's always food. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of favorite restaurants and things, and you will specifically go out of your way, especially on a day off or the weekend or whatever, and you go with one of the girls somewhere, you'll go pick up one of my favorite food items.
Scott's easy because he has so many favorite foods, but they're all out of my way. So It is definitely an active
I have a lot of favorite foods, but they're quite specific. Mm-hmm. So roti, I mean, that's probably my ultimate. Caribbean roti is, like, go for one. Can you pick one up later for me this week?
No. Yeah.
No. Another one is giving me time to 3D print or do some work around the house that's been falling behind. Mm-hmm. I feel like you did that for me this weekend, which was very nice. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. We spent lots of time doing that. It was nice.
Are you saying that in a
I'm saying that
way?
No, I'm not saying that in a sarcastic way. I'm saying that in a way that I was happy to give you that time.
Yeah, we got a bunch of stuff around the house fixed, which was nice. And then I would say the last one is a little more broad, but actually listening. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, maybe this is a misconception, but sometimes I feel like, actually listening, but not like over validating.
I hear you.
Yeah. I find that type of thing, like validation, to be incredibly annoying.
I don't think you find validation to be annoying. I think you find over validation.
Yeah, over validation, or like when it seems to be a bit much. Like, do you really agree with me here, or are you just saying it so that I'll stop talking about it?
Yeah, that's what. But I think if I actually validate you, like, oh, it makes sense that you feel like that.
Yeah,
that doesn't bother you.
Tell me more about this.
Like, help me understand, like, why is that bothering you? That doesn't bother you.
No.
That if I'm like, Scott, that's so hard, you're like, okay, Jess.
Yeah.
Pull it together.
Yeah. I would say that is... I joked about the food, but that's probably the biggest one.
I'd say the other biggest one is...
For me?
Yep.
Okay.
Showing interest in the things that you're interested about.
You think?
Like, for example, Scott loves a lot of things. That's the thing.
When do you do this?
Rarely. That's why.
Explain that to me.
It's very calculated. I only do it. No, I'm just kidding.
Sounds healthy.
You have a lot of interests. So, I mean, it's impossible for me to show interest in all of them all the time because that would be inauthentic to me. Because you have a lot of interests of things I'm not necessarily super interested in. But let's say Formula One. I know that's something that you really like and really enjoy and you have for years. So I started trying to follow all the players on Instagram and trying to get to know who they were so that when you're talking about them, I would understand what you're talking about. And I started sitting and watching some games with you. Is this all wrong?
Players, games.
It's not players.
It's drivers and races.
At least I didn't say characters. That's where we started.
Yeah, that's because the way I got you interested was finally Drive to Survive came out.
Yeah, that's true.
And I was like, here, Jess, watch this.
Yeah.
And it might give you, it might make you a bit more interested in the dynamics. Not that it's necessarily real, but and that is what you started calling them characters after you started watching that.
Yeah, well, they were kind of characters on the show. Anyway, but like actually sitting with you and watching a race together, I think that helps you feel loved and seen. And it's also quality time together.
Yep. Did you watch races with me last year?
I watched a few.
Not the whole thing. I feel like you would sit for a minute and then leave.
Yeah.
But you did tell me this weekend that you were actually interested. But probably by the time this episode airs, no, maybe it would be a couple weeks after this episode airs. It would be the first race in Australia. And we'll see if you sit through an entire race with me.
I told Scott I'd watch them at night with him if he would save them till after the kids go to bed. So we'll try it.
It's tricky for me, but okay.
Okay, here's how I feel deeply seen by you. I think when you can kind of like the lights, but identify something that might be bothering me in the house or like annoying me, and without me having to ask or say anything about it, you just take care of it. So like the lights are one example, but like let's say the dishes, you know, you make breakfast for the kids and you know it drives me nuts when I have to clean the dishes for a breakfast that I can't eat because I have celiac, and sometimes they'll make like pancakes or something. And you'll just...
The girls get flour everywhere.
The girls get flour everywhere. It's something that I want them to have the experience of having pancakes with gluten in them, but it's hard for me because I have celiac, so I can't really participate in that. And so when you go ahead and make that for them and then clean the whole kitchen after, that helps me feel really seen because I'm like, I know I don't have to worry about that, and that's all taken care of, and my girls are happy. So that I think helps me feel really seen. I think when you notice things like that I haven't been caring for myself in the best way, like, you know, in different seasons when I've been burnt out, and you kind of step in and you say, okay, Jess, you know, I'm going to help you out with this and this, and why don't you go get your nails done? And you see, again, I feel like a lot of it comes down to like seeing my needs before I have to ask for it. I think you're really good at doing that. For the most part, I think you're quite good at it. And you're quite good at, if I say, I need this, like I need to go take a shower and I need no one to bother me or whatever.
Yeah.
I think you're pretty good at doing that.
I do my best corralling the girls, but
yes, sometimes they still find a way to sneak in.
They'll try and break in.
So I think that's a way. I think another thing that's just like a really subtle way that I feel seen and known is if I write something, and I know it might not necessarily be super of interest to you, but I'm like, Scott, I want to read you this thing I just wrote just for fun.
Yep.
And you like actually sit and listen to the thing that I wrote, whether it's like a poem or a little story or something. And I do a lot of writing for fun. And you listen to it, whether or not you're interested in what I'm saying, and then show me that you actually heard what I said. I feel like that helps me feel really seen. It's like, oh, okay, I can talk to you about this.
And do you appreciate the fact that I usually don't give you too much feedback?
Mm-hmm. That's something I think you've learned over time.
Mm-hmm.
I think, you know, Scott's the skeptic. And so I think for a time there, it's like I would try and tell you something that was like on my heart or read you something, then you just immediately have like a skeptical feedback to it.
Yep.
And that really messed with my head and made me feel like I didn't want to share everything with you because I'm like, I don't necessarily want feedback. I just want you to hear what I have done. And so I think...
Well, at the time, I think I saw it because there were others that were doing the same thing to you. And it was making things worse for you.
And I think just understanding... I think the last year specifically, you've really come to understand me, and I've come to understand myself in a new way of like what I can handle, where my strengths are, and what they're not. But like you never shame me for that, and I feel like that helps me feel really known too. You never like, just you should be better at this, you know. And maybe you used to be like that, like you should be more organized, or you should XYZ. But I think the last year I felt very seen by you because you're like, oh, maybe we don't have the same strengths. Maybe you're more on this end of things. Like, you need to be more creative and have time to write and think and process and be with the kids. And that's how you do best. And maybe the way you do best is different than me. And I think you've really, really come to just respect who I am and how I operate and what I need.
Yep.
And I feel like have felt more seen by you in the last like year and a half than like I felt seen by you our whole marriage. But I think the last year and a half, we've really come to understand ourselves, which has really helped strengthen our relationship too.
Yep, for sure.
So I feel
Beautiful.
like, yeah. So hopefully,
Can you tell me something nice? Words of affirmation. Tell me that I'm good.
Well, everyone always thinks Scott needs a lot of words of affirmation.
Everyone always thinks, what
No,
are you
I'm kidding.
talking about?
There's
I feel
one
like
comment
we received
one
one
time.
comment once.
But I always keep that in the back of my mind.
If you're listening to this episode, can you please tell me that I'm doing a good job?
Yeah, give Scott a word of affirmation.
I really need it, according to this one person.
So we are definitely curious to get people's feedback, I think, on this episode. And again, we're not trying to say the love languages are all bad. You know, there's obviously you can all do all those things for your kids and your partner, and they're all great.
Well, I mean, some of the things that we were talking about would
Right.
fit under those buckets.
But we're just trying to encourage you to think a little deeper about it. And hey, if it's not working for your relationship, maybe there's a different approach that might get you to that deeper level that you need in order to build
I
that
think
trust.
regardless,
Yeah.
it's probably a good idea to get to that deeper level with your spouse or your child or whoever you're in a relationship with.
Yeah, even friends.
Yep.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, let us know what you thought of this episode. And let us know if there's like another topic like this that you'd like us to cover. This is really interesting for us. And we would love to have more conversations like this.
It's the first time I've put together a full lit review. This is just a summary of the lit review, but the actual lit review is many pages long. So
Scott had fun with this one.
it was kind of fun.
Yeah.
I felt like I was back in university.
I know. Look at you. Who's the expert now?
Not me.
You're just good at reviewing other experts' opinions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Well, let us know what you think, and we'll talk to you again next week. Hey, thank you so much for being here and listening to this episode today. It means the world to us to have you here. If this conversation was helpful for you, it would mean a lot if you could like and subscribe. That just shows us if the conversation is meaningful and helpful and helps it get out to more people. Also, I just wanted to let you know that every week we have a new episode drop. And if you want to be notified when that happens, just hit the little bell icon. Again, thank you so much for being here, and we will talk to you again next week.